Hey everybody, so this video is going to be kind of interesting. Once again, I got the fan going, I hope that's okay. Anyway, so this is Captain Mark here, and years ago, I watched the TV show Punky Brewster. It's from the 80s, and the premise of the show was that a little girl gets abandoned, and this old man ends up finding her. She tries to look after herself, and he kind of takes her in. He hopes that maybe her mother would be located, but she's never located, she's never found. So he ends up, through a series of events, looking after her, and then eventually adopting her as his own. And he's kind of like this bitter old man, and then he ends up softening his heart. So I thought the show had charm, and I was a little disappointed that it ended only after 4 seasons. I think it would have been interesting to see Punky tackling her high school years. I thought that would have been interesting. So this ended up turning into me kind of brainstorming a possible future episode, a fan fiction story, if you will. Although for some reason saying fan fiction, it feels weird to say, but this was my first shot actually at trying to write some material based off of like a already existing thing. And I wrote this in March 2018. So I wrote this years ago. So it's kind of interesting looking back at it. But anyway, so what I'm bringing you in this video is what I wrote. And this is a I guess hypothetical future episode. This probably would have been like, let's say season 4. I think it's season 4, she's in 6th grade. So season 4, season 5, season 6, season 7. This might be like let's see, grade 6, grade 7, grade 8, grade 9. So let's just say this is probably like season 7, hypothetically. So let me just start. So this is September 1990. The scene opens up with Henry reading the newspaper in the living room. Henry says, "Punky? Punky, come eat your breakfast already. You're going to be late for your first day of high school." Behind the bathroom door, Punky exclaims, "Okay, Henry, I'll be there in a sec." Henry sighs. Henry says, "Punky, you said that 3 times already. When will 'I'll be there in a sec' actually be a sec?" Punky again from behind the washroom door. "You said it yourself, Henry. Today is my first day of high school, and I wanna at least look alright." Henry says, "Oh, I'm sure you look great, Punky. Now come on out and eat your breakfast." Punky says, "Okay, I'm just about out." Punky comes out of the bathroom looking like typical Punky, wearing a bunch of bright mixed matched colors. She's got on a dark purple boot on her left foot and a dark red boot on her right. She also has on blue stockings with a dark red skirt and a purple sweater. On her head, she's wearing a blue headband with a bow on it, pulling her long brown layered hair with her thin bangs hovering just over her eyes, and of course, a bright yellow bandana tied on around her right leg. Punky says, "So Henry, how do I look?" Henry gets up from the couch and responds in a joking tone. Henry says, "You look like my daughter Punky." Then Punky says, "Seriously, Henry, give it to me straight." Henry, "You look great, Punky." Punky says, "You think so? I try to mix match like I always do, but subtly this time, with at least 2 pieces of clothing with the same colors. After all, I'm in high school now. I'm more mature." Henry looking at Punky confused with the amount of thought Punky put into her outfit. Henry replies, "I see, and thanks for reminding me that you're no longer a little girl." With a humbled facial expression, Punky pats Henry on the arm. Punky says, "Henry, I'm still your little girl. I'm just in high school now." There's a knock on the door. Punky says, I'll get it, probably cherry. Henry says, when you return, eat your breakfast, it's getting cold. And heads for the washroom, mumbling to himself. Punky opens the door. It's Cherry. Cherry has her backpack slinged over her right shoulder, and she is dressed in clothes that she too carefully picked out, wearing mostly dark colors, contrast to Punky. Punky takes a notice of it. Punky says, nice. I definitely approve of your first day threads. She does this while nodding, with her eyebrows up and her lips tucked in. Cherry says, likewise, sister. Cherry then continues to say in a reluctant tone, not gonna lie, Punky, I'm kinda nervous. The two teens take a seat on the couch, Punky in a relaxed pose, with Cherry on the other hand uneasy. Oh, why's that, Cherry? Says Punky. Cherry says, well, it's a new environment, a new school, new teachers, new students. Punky says, it's not so bad, Cherry. We know some of the kids from our old school will be there, and we can meet new and interesting people, maybe even make new friends. I mean, that's exciting, right? Cherry says, I guess so. Punky says, don't worry, I'll be with you. We are in the same boat. Cherry looks at her watch, and her eyes open wide. Cherry says, Punky, we're going to be late for the bus. Punky jumps up from the couch and runs over to pick up her bag that was leaned up against the wall by the front door. Punky says, come on, Cherry, let's go. Cherry says, okay. Henry then comes out of the washroom and notices Punky and Cherry gone. Henry then says to himself in a disappointed tone, no goodbyes, and squints looking in a deep thought, and then turns over and walks over to the kitchen and sees Brandon on a chair eating Punky's breakfast of eggs, bacon, and toast. Then Henry says to himself, and no breakfast was eaten. Henry glaring over at the scene with Brandon licking his own face and the plate, Henry then says to Brandon, well, except you, Brandon, you had a 2-course meal. What was in your dog bowl and what was served as Punky's breakfast. Henry takes a seat beside Brandon and pats his head and takes a deep breath and says to Brandon, I sure hope her first day will go good. I sure hope her first day will be good to her. Poor girl will be hungry. I can't believe my little girl's in high school. I can't believe my little girl is a high school student. So this is the end of scene 1. Scene fades into Punky and Cherry walking around in their new high school. Toward the camera. The girls can't help but have grins on their faces, looking at the new surroundings. A small group of 3 handsome teenage boys walk by them, causing the girls to stop. The boys were diverse, with one of them with fair skin having long blonde hair, one of them with a Spanish look sporting dark brown hair with a 90s curtains haircut that is tapered down at the back with the front fringe falling below the eye length, and a boy of African descent wearing a flat top hairstyle. It's interesting that I went into that detail. Both girls look at each other. Impressed, Cherry says, you're right, Punky. I think things will be all right. The girls approach where a new hall begins, and a set of lockless lockers begin to the right, their left. From the right, a familiar sound. Greetings, peasants. Punky and Cherry look at each other and search for the voice. Lean up against a locker, it's Margot. Margot! Each of the girls exclaim. Margot says, it's about time you guys got here. We shouldn't wait another second if we want to be locker neighbors. Punky says, cool, I can't wait to decorate it. So which lockers should we take? Cherry says, the lockers down here have a window near by. That could be nice. Margot then says, I don't think so. If we're too close to the window, when the sun is out, it will get too hot. And if it gets too hot, my hair will start to stand up. And we can't have that. It's in our best interest to settle elsewhere. Cherry says, well, it's good you take us into consideration. Punky says, how about over there? Punky points directly to the right. Margot says, do you really want lockers that close to the washroom? Not only would it have heavy traffic, In our immediate surroundings, I can only imagine the possibilities of any foul stench, and I hear they serve really beanie sloppy joes in the cafeteria on Tuesdays. Cherry, who of course loves to eat, is lit up and excited. Cherry says, "Really? Wow, Punky, you're right. Things are going to be swell." Punky says, "Well, Margot, I figured you'd like the washroom, seeing as you like mirrors so much." Margot says, "Thanks for thinking of me, Punky, but you won't have to worry about that once we choose lockers. I'll have my own little setup, see?" Margot then goes into her bag. Punky and Cherry look at one another in preparation of what Margot may have in her bag. Margot pulls out a large oval mirror with lights all around the frame. "As you can see, my reflective needs are taken care of," Margot says. The group of 3 handsome boys return with paper slips and locks in their hands. The Spanish-looking boy with curtains hair, what does it say here? Looks down at the slip. I'm just gonna say it says that. I'm a little confused about what it says. Looking down at the slip, his hair falling in wisps in front of his eyes, says out loud to the other boys, "This is it, boys. Our lockers for the year." All 3 girls look at each other with a wide grin, and they say together, "That looks like a good spot." 3 girls walk by. They look kind of tough, with one with long blonde hair, with a messy, flopped over side part, wearing a flannel shirt with a t-shirt on the inside exposing her belly, and wearing black pants. One of the girls is wearing a tight-fitted black shirt and a pair of mom jeans, with her hair kept the same way except her hair is brown. The other girl's wearing a tight-fitted red t-shirt with a denim vest with a matching denim skirt, and wearing a pair of big hoop earrings with almost ginger hair. Each girl wearing heavier makeup than Punky, Cherry, and Margot, and also seem to be wearing the same pair of combat boots. The 3 girls take the lockers Punky and her friends wanted. Punky, Cherry, and Margot share their disappointment. Cherry says, "Aw, man." Margot says, "Well, if we hurry, maybe we can get the next set of lockers. We won't be very far." Punky says, "Well, let's go get our numbers." The girls run over to get their numbers toward us and diagonally to the left, going down the same hall as before. End of scene 2. The scene fades into Henry at Punky's place. There is standing a large rectangular item in the size of a fridge, extensively wrapped in bubble wrap. A man in a brown uniform comes out. A man in a brown uniform comes into Punky's place with a clipboard asking for Henry's signature. Uniformed man says, "Sign, please. Sign here, please, Mr. Warnemont." Henry signs where needed, and the man politely thanks Henry and leaves the premises. Next, Mrs. Johnson comes in as the man in the uniform is leaving. He leaves the door open for her to enter. Mrs. Johnson, in her scrubs, walks down to meet Henry, who is standing just by the big rectangular object. Mrs. Johnson says, "Hey, Henry." Henry says, "Oh, hi, Betty. To what do I owe this visit?" Mrs. Johnson says, "Well, Henry, Cherry was so uptight about her first day of high school, she emptied out the whole fridge." She then continues in a sassy tone, "So I figured I'd grab something on the way to work so I don't go on an empty stomach. I swear this girl eats when she is mad, sad, tired, disappointed, nervous, or even happy." "How about hungry?" Henry adds. Mrs. Johnson says, "Cherry eats when she isn't even hungry. I swear she eats when she's mad, sad, tired, disappointed, nervous, or happy." "How about hungry?" Henry adds. Maybe you guys can imagine a laugh track where a cheesy joke is made. Mrs. Johnson continues saying, Cherry eats when she isn't even hungry. I swear it's that child's favorite pastime. It's what she does when her schedule frees up and has nothing to do. It's a good thing her best friend lives in the same building, or else there won't be any food left for me. Henry says, she has been quite the cook for me. I'm very thankful she is using her talents here at Punky's place. It's been a big help. I know she wanted to be an architect, but, however, if she changes her mind, she has an easy plan B in sight. Mrs. Johnson says, I don't even know how she stands making all that food for customers and not sinking in her teeth herself before serving it away. By the way, Henry, what's this? Henry says, oh, this? It's my latest investment. She was talking about, of course, the big rectangular object. Mrs. Johnson says, investment? The only investment you make is investing your time and not investing, you cheapskate. Henry then says, well, Betty, I've made a purchase that will do Punky's place some benefit. Mrs. Johnson says, tell me what it is already. Henry then says, all right. Seeing that you're here, would you give me a hand? Mrs. Johnson says, sure. Mrs. Johnson and Henry take off, the wrapping of bubble wrap, revealing it to be an arcade game. Mrs. Johnson says, this is your investment, Henry? A video game? Henry says, yes, Betty, you're right on the nose. Have you seen the arcade? Have you seen the arcade at the mall? Or how about the bowling alley? Mrs. Johnson says, yes, I have. Henry says, it has come to my attention that these video games are kid magnets. I got a hold of the people behind these machines. They told me the one before us is a hit with the youth. Mrs. Johnson says, oh, really? Well, Henry, I must admit, I think you're on to something. Henry says, thank you. You know me, Betty. I don't Henry says, thank you. You know me, Betty. I don't dispense of my money on just any old thing without a good reason. Sorry for stumbling on my word for a second there. Mrs. Johnson says, Mrs. Johnson analyzes the machine, exploring it left and right. She looks over to Henry. Mrs. Johnson then says, well, Henry, let's fire it up. Henry looks at her, amused with a smirk. Henry then says, Betty, are you looking to play this video game? Betty looks back at him, puckered-lipped, her eyes wide open and hands on her hips. Mrs. Johnson says, why, you think I got no game? It's sorry, I'm actually reading this back for the first time in years, so it's kind of interesting reading all this. Henry chuckles to himself. Henry then says, you can't be serious. She says, why can't I be good at a video game? Is it because I'm not young and hip with the times? Henry then says, I won't even get started on your hips. Mrs. Johnson then says, why don't you go into the kitchen and make me a turkey sandwich while I kill the time out here? After all, I'm a paying customer. Henry says, tell you what, I'll charge you half price if you I'll charge you half price if you last as long in the game as it takes me to prepare your sandwich. Mrs. Johnson says, you're on, Henry, and take your time. Henry plugs the arcade game into the nearest outlet and heads for the kitchen. When the game turns on, it reveals itself as a shooting game where you play as a spaceship. Mrs. Johnson puts a quarter in, then types out her name, Betty J, in the username. Mrs. Johnson says, easy so far. An early 90s 16-bit pixelated animatic appears on the screen, and the game starts. The level begins. Mrs. Johnson seems to have control and has an early understanding of the controls and mechanics. Her body motion would indicate how into the game she really is. Henry returns from the kitchen with Mrs. Johnson's sandwich in a paper bag. Henry amazed and amused to see she is lasting this long. Henry says, Mrs. Johnson, I can't say that I'm not impressed. Mrs. Johnson finally crashes her ship into a pixelated mountain and turns over to Henry, and she says, look what you did. Henry says, I have not done anything. Mrs. Johnson says, "You distracted me and it cost me my spaceship." Henry says, "Nonetheless, Betty, you only owe me half price." Mrs. Johnson says, "Oh, all right." Mrs. Johnson looks at the main menu to see her name with the high score, Betty J. Mrs. Johnson says, "Look, Henry, I've got the highest score," with a big grin. Then Henry says, "Don't flatter yourself too much, Betty. You're the only one who's played it." Mrs. Johnson says, "Something tells me this machine will see the return of Betty Johnson. But for now, duty calls. Off to work. Thanks for the sandwich, Henry." Henry then says, "You're very welcome, Betty. Have a good day." She pays him and leaves. Okay. I'm enjoying this, actually. I hope you are too out there. Mrs. Johnson leaves the restaurant, leaving Henry all by himself. He looks around and nobody's there to serve. He runs over to the open sign on the front of the door and turns it closed and runs back to the arcade game. Henry then tells himself, "Can't say that I'm not curious." He taps himself for any change and takes out a quarter out of his pocket and he pops it into the game and the game fires up. He enters his initials, Henry W. And the level begins. With only a few seconds in the game, he crashes the spaceship. In shock, Henry exclaims, "What? Already?" The game returns to the main menu where it says Betty J over top of his initials. Henry then says, "Great. There for everybody to see." End of scene 3. I'm enjoying this. This does demand that you, are familiar with the show, I guess. Because this is starting into a hypothetical season, what did I say, 7? But anyways, I hope you're enjoying the ride so far. Alright. The scene fades back into Punky's new school at the same lockers from before. Lockers facing us, in brackets. Punky, Cherry, and Margot return to the lockers, each with their class schedule and locks. With 3 lockers separating Punky from the group of boys by the group of 3 girls from before, with Cherry beside Punky and Margot next to her, heading towards the right. Punky, Cherry, and Margot put their bags in their lockers. Margot says, "I'll have somebody install my mirror later." Cherry says, "Hopefully you can last." Hopefully you can last. The 3 girls from before return to their lockers. The girl wearing the denim vest is the furthest from Punky, with the girl with the brown hair next to her, and lastly the blonde girl next to her. Punky turns to her left and decides to introduce herself. With a big grin, she turns and says, "Looks like we're locker neighbors." The blonde girl looks her up and down and says, "Yeah, looks like it." Her tone didn't make for a friendly introduction. The girl turns back to digging around in her locker. Punky decided to further the conversation after a second of taking in her tone. Punky then says, "I'm Punky Brewster." The blonde girl says, "Wait, say that again?" Punky says, "My name is Punky Brewster." Punky puts her hand out for a handshake. The girl gives her a look of disgust and says, "Your name is Punky?" The other 2 girls crowd around. "What kind of name is that?" the blonde girl says. Punky puts her hand down, slowly while nervously blinking rapidly, and noticing the attention of the other 2 girls. Punky says, "I know, it's a little unusual, but it's a nickname. You see, my real name is Penelope, but I prefer Punky, so that's what I call myself." The blonde girl says, "That's interesting decision-making." The girls look at each other while on the verge of giggling, and they take off with their binders. As they leave, they give the group of boys a flirtatious wave, and the boys give them a smirk. Punky left confused and a little hurt. She turns back towards her friends to the right. Cherry says, "So, who's your locker neighbor, Punky?" Punky says, "She never mentioned her name." Next, a group of totally nerdy-looking boys show up at the lockers beside Margot. She looks at them in disappointed shock. As they look back, with each a wide grin, she turns back around to her friends. The nerdy boys behind her back are are giving each other a high five, suggesting they had their eye on no set of lockers because of Punky, Cherry, and Margot. Margot says, "Sure glad the lockers open the way they do." The open locker flaps to the right. She can hide her face. Cherry then says, "Look at the time. The bell should ring any second now. What class you guys have?" Margot says, "Science, room 102. Cherry says, "Me too." Punky says, "I've got science too, but it's room 104. Punky disappointed she won't be joining her friends. It shows by her posture. Punky disappointed she won't be joining her friends shows by her posture. Then the bell rings. Punky reaches in her pocket to grab her binder. What did I say? Pocket? My fault. Punky reaches in her locker to grab her binder for her class. Because the group of girls had left, there was room to see the group of boys 3 lockers down. The long-haired blonde boy is the furthest from her, and the African boy next to him, making the Spanish boy closest to Punky. Their eyes meet, and Punky gives him a smile, and he smiles back, and Punky's stomach suddenly makes a loud growl. The boy makes an awkward reaction to it, and then takes off with a binder of his own, and the other boys follow. Punky, with an embarrassed look, holds her stomach, reminding her that she hadn't eaten her breakfast. Punky and her friends walk side by side till they get to their respective classrooms. Margot walks in. Margot walks in. Cherry makes a reach-out gesture to Punky as if to say, "I don't want to be separated." Punky does it back as she goes into her own classroom. Immediately going into classroom 104, Punky spots the 3 girls, all in the class sitting at the very back. Punky being the last to file in, she looks around the classroom. She spots only a couple of empty seats. Punky notices one of the free spots, and beside the free spot there sits a girl who looks like she could be half Asian, wearing her hair in a high ponytail with a white turtleneck sweater on. Punky decides to take the free spot next to her. Again, I'm intrigued that I went into that detail of describing the different people. Punky then says, "Mind if I sit?" Asian girl says, "Not at all." Punky sits down on the right of her. She quickly notices that she has a Nelson band binder. Punky says, "You like Nelson, huh?" The Asian girl says, "I think they're the coolest." Punky then says, "But you know what the coolest part is, right?" Together they say in unison, "There's 2 of them." Together they share a laugh. Then Punky says, "Hi, I'm Punky." The Asian girl says, "Hi, I'm Amy." The class begins. A teacher comes into the classroom. She has a gentle-looking face, tall with brown hair, ending at the near end of her neck. Wearing a typical teacher attire, including a beige blouse. The teacher says, "Hello, class. I'm Miss Morgan. Welcome to Grade 9 Science. First things first, let's take the attendance." So the teacher takes the attendance, and she calls out the first name. "Patrick Boiler." "Here," you can hear someone say in the background. Punky knows that her last name, starting with a B, she's most likely next, and because of her distaste of her real name, Henry had it changed to Punky on all her school documents. Miss Morgan then says, "Punky Brewster." The girls in the back giggle to themselves. Some other kids look around to see who could be named Punky. Punky raises her hand slowly, sinking into her seat. Punky says, "I'm here." The teacher continued until reaching the last kid, and then she introduced the first module. Miss Morgan then says, so our first little project is going to be fun. What we are going to do is incubate some real eggs and hopefully watch some chicks hatch from their eggs. So I'm going to have you get into groups of 2, and each of you will have one chick once it hatches, and you will take care of it in a tank until we return them to the farm. We will also explore the development of the chicks. So find yourself a partner. Punky and Amy look at each other. Punky then says, wanna? And Amy says, sure. Chicks are so cute. Punky says, yeah, and so is Nelson. Punky and Amy share a laugh together. End of scene 4. I myself am still getting a kick out of this. Okay. So scene opens up with Henry still playing the game. He crashes his spaceship again. Henry, oh no, not again, he says. The game goes into its main menu, where you see the top scores. 8 Henry W initials underneath Betty J. Henry pats himself to feel no more change in his pocket. Henry then says, out of change? I guess I'll go to the register. Henry goes to open the cash register, then he stops himself. Then Henry says, now, Henry. It wouldn't be right to take from the cash register for a silly old game. Henry glances at the arcade game from across Punky's place, looking at the main menu's top score screen. Henry having a hard time dealing with the temptation. He says, maybe just one more game before I open, says Henry. Punky's place is already past opening hours, but Henry doesn't want to give up. End of scene 5. This is fun, man. This is fun. The scene fades back into Punky's new school. Sorry. Punky and Amy walk down the hall towards us. Then make a left towards Punky's locker. Alright. All in the while, singing Love and Affection by Nelson. When they arrive, Cherry and Margot are already at their lockers and turn around to see Punky and Amy singing Nelson. Punky says, hey guys, this is my new friend Amy. Amy, this is Cherry and Margot. They've been my friends for like forever now. Amy gives Cherry and Margot a handshake. Amy says, nice to meet you both. Cherry says, so you're into Nelson, huh? Amy says, sure am. Cherry then says, Margot and I argue over who is the cuter twin all the time. Margot says, that's because Gunner's the cuter twin. Then Cherry says, well, I think Matthew's the cuter twin. Punky says, they're both the cuter twin. The blonde girl shows up from behind and says, none of them are the cuter twin. They look like chicks. The 3 tough girls show up at their lockers just next to Punky's locker. Punky and her friends awkwardly just stand there. Cherry hides her face and rolls her eyes. The 3 girls leave towards the bathroom. Amy then says, never mind them. Punky, would it be okay if I sit with you at lunch? Punky decides to play around with her. Then she says, well, I would have invited you, but you already asked. Sure you can. Amy then says, cool. I brought my Walkman. We can listen to Nelson at lunch together. Punky says, sounds like a plan. Amy says, had I known we would get along so well, I would have picked a locker next to yours. Punky then says, well, so far, I wouldn't mind it if those 3 girls next to me moved out. Punky, Margot, Cherry, and Amy share a laugh. This is end of scene 5. The scene fades back into Punky's place, where Henry is gazing across the restaurant with his fists to his chin, resting hunched over the counter by the cash register with a smile. He is looking at his new high score, positioned just over Betty J, with 14 of his initials under hers. 15 spots are visible on the machine's main menu. Henry all of a sudden feels a poke to his right shoulder. Sir? Sir? Can we get some service? The camera pans out to reveal a man and his family, which includes a wife and a son. Henry has since turned over the close sign upon beating Mrs. Johnson's score. Henry then says, yes, of course. Have a seat anywhere you see fit. The family sit down at a table. The man says, I promised I'd take them out for cheeseburgers today, so that's what we will get. Henry says, sure thing. Anything else? The man says, that will be all, thanks. Then Henry says, all right, coming right up. The son says, Dad, could I have a quarter? I like to play the video game. The man says, sure, son, here you go. Henry comes back out with a tray of burgers. Ah, thanks. Sure look good, the man says. Then Henry says, You're very welcome, sir. Enjoy. Gotta scroll down, my fault. As Henry walks back, he overhears the man say, Son, your burger's here. To which the kid replies, Okay, Dad, I'll be there in a bit. I'll come once I crash. This makes Henry alarmed. He turns around to witness the kid playing the arcade game and is outperforming Henry. Henry says to himself, I've never even got that far before. Now Henry feels threatened. The man says, Son, it's going to get cold. Finally, the kid crashes his ship. Oh, man, the kid says disappointedly after crashing the pixelated ship. The game returns to the main menu, revealing a new entry over Henry W. Now the top score is to the name Space Dude, what does that say? Space Dude JT, my fault. Now the top score is to the name Space Dude JT. Henry clenches his fist and makes a subtle aggravated face. He is displeased he has been overthrown. Okay. End of scene 6. Alright. The scene fades back at school where it is now lunchtime. Punky and her friends, including Amy, each with trays, find a seat in the cafeteria. Amy sits beside Punky and Cherry, and Margot across from them. Margot has a look of disgust. She is more used to a more sophisticated meal. Margot then says, is this prison food? Cherry says, looks good to me. Punky smiles. Margot says, I'd rather eat the grubby grub from Punky's place. Punky and Cherry both together say, gee, thanks, sarcastically. Then Amy says, what's Punky's place? Punky then says, my foster dad runs a restaurant called Punky's Place. Cherry and I work there. Cherry serves as a cook and I'm a waitress. Amy then said, and he named it after you? Punky said, yeah, he did. Amy says, aw, that's adorable. Amy pulls out of her pocket her Walkman tape player. Amy then says, oh, I forgot my earphones in my locker. Then Punky says, don't worry about it, I'll get mine. I have 2 of them, plus a splitter. Sometimes Cherry and I listen to the radio together. Wait here, be right back, and keep an eye on Cherry, so she doesn't eat my lunch. I haven't even eaten my breakfast. Punky gets up from the table and heads over to the hallway. She walks down the same hallway we saw her walk earlier, walking towards us in brackets. Just as she's about to turn left or right to her locker, she overhears the 3 girls chatting amongst themselves. The camera reveals them just standing around their open lockers while Punky is hiding behind the wall. The blonde girl says, and did you see what she's wearing? Oh god, it's like Barney the dinosaur vomited all over her. The girls laugh. The blonde girl then says, she should be called Pukey instead. Punky leans against the wall, holding herself. Her facial expression shows how much that hurt her feelings. She takes a deep breath, remembering her earphones and splitter. She walks by them and to her locker. Punky notices in each of the girls' lockers they have Beastie Boy posters. The 3 tough girls notice her walking by and look at each other because they were just talking about her. Punky gets what she needed out of her locker in speedily fashion, pretending she didn't hear them. Next, a teacher walks by. The teacher says, do you ladies have a hall pass? Punky and the three girls shake their heads no. The teacher then says, "Then back to the calf you go." Punky and the three girls make their way to the calf. Punky tries to keep her eyes face forward to not look at the other girls as they make their way there. Punky returns to the table with the headphones and splitter. She sits down hunched over. Amy says, "Thanks." Punky says, "Oh, yeah, sure thing." Cherry then says, "Eat up, Punky, it's getting cold." And Punky says, "Oh, right." Margot says, "Punky, is everything alright?" Then Punky says, Yeah, I mean, Nelson and food, we're good." She makes a fake smile and gives a thumbs up, then plugs in her earphones and awkwardly takes a bite of her mashed potatoes. End of C7. The scene fades into Punky's place. Punky's place has got some customers, but not too busy. School is now over. Punky and Cherry enter Punky's place with their backpacks. Henry notices they've arrived. Henry says, "Hi, girls. How was your first day of high school?" Cherry says, "It was great. Cute boys, the cat food was satisfactory, and we made a new friend." Punky being unusually quiet, Henry decides to ask her about it. Henry says, "Well, Punky, how was your first impression of high school?" Punky said, it was okay." Henry said, "Just okay?" Punky said, "I mean, nothing super duper happened or anything." Henry said, "Super duper? What was it that you were expecting?" Punky said, "I don't know, just, it was fine. My day was fine." Henry says, "Hungry, I bet." Punky says, "Yes, yeah. It would have been better had I eaten my breakfast. I know you kept reminding me, but silly me, I forgot." Henry felt a little reassured that that's what seemed to be the reason she felt underwhelmed. Henry then says, "Girls, I'd like to remind you how much I appreciate your help around here, especially now that school is back in." Cherry says, "Oh, no problem, Mr. Warnemont. I'm gonna get ready now." Henry says, I've prepared you and Punky some lunch once you're done." Probably should have said dinner. Let's just change that right now. It's dinner instead. "I prepared you and Punky dinner once you're done." Alright. Cherry says, "Thanks, Mr. Warnemont." Punky says, "Henry, we have an arcade game?" Henry says, "Yes, that's the investment I spoke to you about." Punky said, "Investment? How so?" Henry said, "Well, video games are so popular amongst young people, so I figured it would do Punky's place some good to have one." Then Punky goes, "Good idea, Henry." Henry? Punky then points over to the main menu screen with her thumb, showing the amount of attempts Henry played to beat Mrs. Johnson's score. Then Henry says, "Oh, yes, I wanted to know what all the buzz was about as far as video games go. This particular game is a very popular one, or that's what the providers told me." Punky says, "I've got time before my shift. I think I'll give her a try myself." Henry says, "Okay, Punky, but don't forget to eat what I've prepared for you now." Punky says, "Okay, Henry, I won't, I promise." "Oh, Henry?" Henry stops in his tracks. Punky says, "I was wondering, could I maybe leave a little early today? There are things I need to buy." Henry says, "Things?" Punky says, "Yeah, it's for school." Henry goes, "Okay then." Punky says, "Thanks, Henry." Henry makes his way back to the kitchen. Punky puts a quarter into the arcade machine and begins to punch in her name. Punky B. Before clicking enter, she glares at her name on the screen, remembering the girls making fun of her name. Punky wears a frown, then shrugs her shoulders and says, "We're in Punky Place anyway." She clicks enter and enters the level. Cherry has a seat on a stool at the front counter where her burger awaits her. Cherry goes, "At last." Henry comes out from the back, still a little concerned with Punky's behavior when she talked about school. Henry walks over to Cherry and asks, "Was Punky acting unusual today?" Cherry says, "I don't know. She's kinda an unusual girl. I think that's why we're friends." Henry says, "How about out of the ordinary for her?" Cherry says, "Hard to say, Mr. Warnemont. We don't share many of our classes." Punky in the background goes, "Yes." Punky turns to Henry and Cherry with a big smile. Punky shows the top score. Punky goes, "Top score, yeah!" Henry is in amazement. Punky makes her way over to her sandwich that awaits her. Henry, "Your first try?" Punky said, "Yup. I can see why the kids love it." Henry shakes his head. He turns back into the kitchen, mumbling to himself, "It's just a game, Henry, it's just a game." End of scene 8. The scene fades into later that evening where sneakily exits Punky's place early, as she mentioned to Henry. Henry looks around for Punky. He finds Cherry and asks where she went. Cherry said, "I think she left." Henry says, "I see. She told me that she wanted to leave early to go buy stuff for school. She didn't invite you?" Cherry said, "No, she didn't." Henry, "Interesting." The scene fades into Henry walking into their home after hours during the night. Henry asks, "Punky? Punky?" Punky is in her room in the dark, pushing shopping bags behind Brandon's doghouse. Punky hops into bed and turns to Brandon, who's in the doghouse. Punky says, "Brandon, pretend I'm asleep, okay? I don't want to have to talk to Henry about what I went out and bought." Henry says, "Punky." You can hear in the background, "Punky." "Shh. He's coming. I'm asleep, okay?" says Punky. Harry makes his way to Punky's room. He sees Punky sleeping and makes a grin. Henry says, "Poor girl. Her busy day must have tired her out." Henry goes over to Punky to give her a kiss on her forehead. Then he leaves. Punky sits up and takes a deep breath. Punky goes, "Whew. Close call." "Well, Brandon, seeing as I'm all tucked in, I'm gonna snooze away. Nighty-night." End of scene 9. The next morning, Henry's up early and dressed for the day. Henry, "Punky, I'm getting an early start to make up for my late start yesterday. Your breakfast is waiting for you." In a quiet tone, he mumbles to himself, "No video games for you today, Henry." Punky pokes her head out of her bedroom door to see if the coast is clear. Punky pops her head back into her room. "Perfect," Punky says. Punky now facing a large mirror in her room with Brandon as well, looking at the reflection. The crowd goes, "Ooh." Punky's dressed completely different. Wearing an oversized denim jacket with a green flannel shirt underneath unbuttoned, with a white t-shirt underneath exposing her lower part of her torso, and wearing a matching flannel skirt with dark stockings underneath, with holes in them, and a pair of construction boots. Her hair is just let loose with no accessories. Punky says, "Thanks for chewing the stockings, Brandon. Way cool." Then Brandon barks, "Woof." Then Punky says, "I know it doesn't make sense, Brandon, but clothes look cool when they look worn out." "So, do I look cool?" Brandon blocks his eyes with his paws. Punky says, "That's saying a lot from someone who doesn't even wear clothes." Then Brandon barks again, "Woof." Alright, then Punky says, "This is what I've decided to wear to school today, and that's that." Brandon barks a couple more times. Punky says, "Well, Brandon, if I don't eat my breakfast now, I won't have time to, and I'm not going to spend that time changing out of my new threads." Punky leaves her room. The camera zooms in on Brandon, who watches her leave. End of scene 10. Scene fades into the living room, and there is a knock on the door. Punky runs out of the kitchen to get the door. Cherry once again at the door with her bag. Cherry's eyes open wide, looking at her and up and down. Cherry says, "Punky, what happened?" Punky goes, hmm? Cherry says, your clothes. Punky goes, oh, it's just a new look. Cherry says, new look? Why? Punky says, Cherry, it's a natural part of life. It's called maturing. Now let's get a move on or we will miss our bus. The two teens make a quick break for it, closing the door behind them. End of scene 11. Margot, already at her locker, waits for her friends. Upon their arrival, she stands witness to Punky and her new clothes. Margot says, Punky, were you running late and came to school in your pajamas? They went through the lost and found and changed into, well, that? Cherry says, apparently it's Punky's new look. Margot says, new? But your clothes look like raggedy hand-me-downs. Did your tailor even advise you that your jacket is much too big for your stature? Punky says, I don't have a tailor, and it's supposed to be too big. Margot says, huh? Punky pats Margot on the arm. Punky says, it's okay, Margot, you'll get used to it. The three tough girls come to their lockers. They each take a look at Punky and what she's wearing. The nearest girl, the blonde girl, looks her up and down while handling her backpack. The blonde girl goes, Punky, right? Punky says, Penny. Blonde girl says, Penny? In a rude tone, she continues. Punky says, yeah, you heard right. Call me Penny. Blonde girl says, I like your threads, Penny. Where'd you get them? Continuing in the same tone, Penny says, a store. The blonde girl looks over to her friends and they all smirk. The blonde girl says, how about you give me the name of the joint you went to get those clothes? Punky said, a place called Garage Garments across town. Blonde girl says, across town, huh? I'll have to make a trip down there sometime. Hey, thanks, Penny. I'm Alicia, by the way. Punky gives her a nod. Alicia and the other girls leave for the foyer. Punky turns back over to her friends, who overheard the conversation. Cherry says, Penny? You want to be called Penny now? Margot says, Penny? Why would you want to be called Penny? That's the smallest piece of money there is. Punky says, I'm just growing up, that's all. Cherry says, are you saying you've outgrown Punky? Punky says, I guess I am. Margot and Cherry look at one another, a little confused and concerned. They notice she looked a lot like how Punky's locker's neighbors dress. The bell rings, the three handsome boys come back to their lockers. Punky gives the nearest one, the Spanish-looking boy, a nod. He nods back with a confused look on his face. Margot turns to Cherry and quietly tells her, should have known her clothes came from a garage. The camera angle coming from inside the locker. Ending of scene 12. It's science class again. Punky immediately walks to the front of the classroom. Punky decides to ask Miss Morgan if she could be referred to as Penny instead of Punky. Before Punky takes a seat next to Amy, Miss Morgan puts the class in session, starting with the attendance. Miss Morgan, Patrick Boiler. Patrick says here. Miss Morgan then says, Penny Brewster. Punky, sitting tall, says, here. Amy turns to Punky with a confused look. Amy says, Penny? I thought your name was Punky. Punky said, yeah, I thought it was too. Penny's more mature sounding, so I thought it would be more suitable now that I'm in high school. After all, my real name is Penelope. Amy says, oh, okay then, Penny. Punky looks back at her with a broken smile. Then she looks down at her desk, hunched over with a half frown. Miss Morgan says, so today, class, we will be choosing our eggs, so come around and pick one. End of the scene. Whichever scene it is at this point. I actually wrote that. Anyway, the scene fades into Punky's place. Henry is serving some people who are seated and are pleased their food has arrived. Mrs. Johnson comes in once again. Mrs. Johnson. Hey, Henry. Henry says, Betty, are you here again to play video games? Mrs. Johnson says, no, to play video games and get a turkey sandwich. I haven't hit the grocery store yet. Henry says, I see, one turkey sandwich coming up. Mrs. Johnson says, Henry? Henry says, yes, Betty? Mrs. Johnson points at the high score still showing many different attempts of Henry. Henry says, I just wanted to know what all the buzz was about. Mrs. Johnson says, did you find it after 15 tries? Henry says, Mrs. Johnson, are you mad I have a higher score than you? Mrs. Johnson says, mad? Why would I be mad if that is going to change in just a moment? Henry says, I've got to see this. Mrs. Johnson says, half-price turkey sandwich says, I beat your top score. Henry says, a half-price turkey sandwich is yours if you reposition yourself above my score. Mrs. Johnson says, and no distractions this time? And Henry says, none from me. Mrs. Johnson cracks her knuckles, puts in a quarter and plays the game while Henry goes to the back to make her sandwich. Henry returns with her sandwich in a paper bag. Mrs. Johnson crashes her ship. Mrs. Johnson says, oh, rats. Henry says, Betty, did you crash your ship already? Mrs. Johnson says, everybody has off days. Henry says, well, let's see if you accumulated enough points. Henry and Mrs. Johnson stand in anticipation for the game to return to its main menu, showing the scores. When the game returns, it shows that Mrs. Johnson didn't beat Henry. Henry goes, yes! People in the restaurant start staring at him. He awkwardly notices the eyes on him. He awkwardly tries to finish his sentence to cover it up. Then he says, yes, Mrs. Johnson, business has been doing well. Thanks for asking. He says in a slightly quieter tone. Henry then says, that will be a full price for your turkey sandwich, Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson gives him a sassy look. Henry says, a bet is a bet, Betty. Mrs. Johnson says, next time let's establish how many tries I get. Henry says, the machine will be here, and I'll be here. In a sassy tone, Mrs. Johnson continues. Thanks for the sandwich, Henry. And may business be good for the remainder of your day, in a sarcastic tone. Henry says, enjoy. End of the scene. The scene fades into Punky and her friends, at lunch, sitting at the same spot, each of them with sloppy joes. Amy pulls out her Walkman tape player. Amy says, anybody want to listen to Nelson? Punky pulls a tape out of her pocket. Punky says, I was thinking maybe we could listen to something else this time. Amy says, oh? Amy takes a look at the tape. Amy says, Beastie Boys? Cherry and Margot look at each other, and they also say, Beastie Boys? Punky says, yeah, Beastie Boys. They're a hip-hop group. Cherry says, since when do you listen to hip-hop? Margot says, since when do you listen to Beastie Boys? Punky says, guys, you haven't heard music if you haven't heard these guys. And Amy goes, and you have? Amy picks up the tape in her hand, which still has the plastic on it, showing that it was very recently bought. Punky takes the tape from her and awkwardly and rapidly rips it off. She hands it to Amy, who has a reluctant face. Punky says, well, I'm about to. Play it. Amy pops out the Nelson tape, takes out the Beastie Boys tape, and puts the Nelson tape in its place. The four girls each take an earphone. Because of the splitter, there's one for each girl. Each of the girls make a distasteful face. Cherry goes, Penny, you like this stuff? Penny says, it's interesting. Margot says, is this even considered music? Punky says, it's art, you just have to understand it is all. Margot says, all I understand is a bunch of yelling. Punky says, that's their genre. Margot says, their genre is yelling? Punky says, no, it's alternative hip-hop. It's like hip-hop, but with a rock edge. Cherry says, no offense, Punky, but I'm not really into it. Margot says, me neither. Amy says, I guess I could give it a chance. I mean, it's only the first song so far. The three girls walk by. The blonde girl notices the Beastie Boys tape case. Alicia, the blonde girl, says, hey, no way, Beastie Boys. Punky acting all tough. She says, good to know you have eyes to see. Alicia says, didn't think chicks like you were into that stuff. Margot and Cherry look at each other and say at once, we're not. Punky says, they just don't get it. Alicia says, so Penny, what's your favorite Beastie Boys song? Punky, with a very focused face, thinks for a sec. Punky goes, shake your rumpa? Clearly, Punky was listening for any lyrics she could pick up, as she still had the earphone in her ear. Alicia, the blonde girl, says, you mean shake your rump? Punky goes, yeah, that hunk of noise is my fave. Margot and Cherry look at each other in confusion. Alicia says, yeah, I like that one too. Say, could I borrow your tape sometime? Punky says, I guess so. She pops out the tape and returns the Beastie Boys tape in its proper place after removing the Nelson tape. Alicia says, ew, was that Nelson tape in there? Amy protectively and quickly puts her Nelson tape back in its case and into her pocket. Punky says, yeah, Barbie and her clone was in there, but don't worry about that anymore. Here, in brackets, making fun of Nelson's long hair. If you don't know Nelson, you can look them up. Early 90s band. She hands over the tape to Alicia, and she takes it and puts it into her pocket. Alicia says, thanks, Penny, I'll return it to you tomorrow. Amy looks at Punky a bit confused. Amy says, Punky, you barely got to listen to your new tape. Punky says, whatever, you guys weren't really into it anyway. Amy says, and I thought you liked Nelson. Punky said, I do, but there's no denying their resemblance to Barbie. Cherry and Margot look at each other with a worried face. Cherry says, but you think the Nelson twins are cute. Does that mean you think Barbie is cute? Punky says, no, just their luscious long blonde hair is kinda like Barbie. Anyway, how are you guys liking the Sloppy Joes? Margot says, I only asked for one because Cherry insisted that Sloppy Joes are the best thing ever, using quotation marks. Cherry, stuffing her face, says with a full mouth, it is. Punky and her friends laugh at the sight. End of scene. The scene fades and lunch is over now. Punky and her friends, Amy included, travel to Punky, Cherry, and Margot's lockers. Each of the girls open their lockers to get their things. Punky all of a sudden holds her stomach in pain. Amy says, Penny, are you okay? Punky says, Margot of all people warned us about the Sloppy Joes. I didn't think I would fall victim. Margot said, and strangely, I enjoyed it. I, however, not experiencing any problems. Punky in pain continues, oof. At this moment in time, I wish we picked the other lockers close to the washroom. The three handsome boys return to their lockers. The Spanish-looking boy nearest to Punky gives her a smile. Punky smiles back, then her stomach makes a big growl. The boy once again makes an awkward face and leaves with the other boys. Punky rolls her eyes and then looks to her stomach and says, really? Her stomach growls again. Punky goes, okay, I gotta go. Punky heads for the washroom as her friends watch her zoom by. Amy then says, hey, has Punky, or Penny rather, has she been acting weird? I mean, I've only known her for a couple of days, and well, I like the Punky from the first day better. Cherry says, yeah, she has been acting rather strange, and I've known Punky ever since we were 7 or 8 years old. Margot says, I've always known her to be attached to the name Punky. Now she wants to be known as Penny. I mean, might as well announce to the whole world that you're poor. Amy says, I really would have liked to gotten to know Punky, not so much Penny. Cherry says, I know she's putting on this rude tough girl act, and I know Punky isn't like that at all. I really wouldn't want people to think of Punky that way, and see who she really is. Margot says, not being herself is exactly what she's doing, and I hope Punky comes back soon. It was Punky that I wanted to be locker neighbors with, not Penny. Amy says, maybe she'll be back soon. Cherry says, maybe not. Those Sloppy Joes seem to have really gotten to her. The girls shake their head, and they part ways and go to their respective classes. The scene cuts to Punky going into one of the stalls. All of a sudden she hears what sounds like Alicia's voice. Punky checks underneath the door to check She can see the 3 combat boots. Alicia says, and did you see what she's wearing? Why the sudden change? She went through a complete transformation in one day. It's like she finally for the first time realized she's a weirdo. Brown hair girl says, do you suppose she overheard us yesterday in the hall? Alicia said, who cares, it's for her own good. It looks like she's actually trying to fit in, instead of wearing those loud clothes that are probably harmful to people's eyesight. Alicia continues, do you honestly think she likes hip-hop? Honestly, if you ask me, the whole thing is just a sad masquerade. The 3 tough girls once again giggle. Punky starts to cry. The 3 tough girls leave the washroom, all but just Punky. Punky's stomach growls once again. Punky tells her stomach, don't worry, I plan on being here for a while, at least until I stop crying. The crowd goes, "Aww." The bell rings. The scene fades into Punky's place once again, where Henry is sweeping the floor. Punky comes with Cherry, about to go to work. Henry, wide-eyed, glares at his foster daughter, Punky. Henry says, Punky, what are you wearing? Cherry says, Penny. Henry says, sorry? Cherry says, it's not Punky anymore, it's Penny. Punky tries to head to the back to avoid talking. Henry says, Punky, wait. Punky stops in her tracks and turns around. Punky says, can we talk later, Henry? We've got a job to do. A large group of people file in. Henry notices the big group, and Punky escapes into the back to change into her uniform. Cherry says, Mr. Warnemont, I can officially say she has been acting very strange. Henry says, what has gotten into her? Cherry says, she keeps insisting that she's maturing and growing up. Henry says, I'd swear that she isn't even the same girl. Cherry says, by her behavior today, I can say that she barely is the same girl. She's been rude and snarky all day, even insulting Nelson. I'm a little worried about her. Henry says, yes, I share your worry. Cherry says, well, I should get into my uniform. Henry thinks to himself for a second. Doesn't have time because he has to serve some customers amongst the group. A young man looks at Henry's name tag. The young man says, hey, are you the same 15 Henrys on the arcade game? Henry makes an embarrassed face. The scene fades into Henry, Punky, and Cherry arriving to their apartment. The 3 stand in front of Henry's and Punky's apartment. Henry says, maybe you and Punky can get a good word in for Punky's place. Punky bows her head towards the floor in an embarrassed kind of gesture. Henry says, maybe you round up enough young people to fill up the top scores beyond where you can see my initials. Cherry says, that's a lot of young people, Mr. Warnemont. Cherry then points to Punky as she has her head bowed. Henry looks back at her and gives Cherry a nod as to say, I got it. Cherry says, well, Mr. Warnemont, I'll see you tomorrow. Good night, Mr. Warnemont. Good night, Punky, or, you know what I mean. Cherry moseys on upstairs. Henry opens the door, and Punky quickly walks in and tries to escape Henry. And as she gets to the entranceway to the hall leading to the washroom and bedrooms, Henry commands her to stop. Punky, Henry yells out. Punky stops in her tracks. Punky says, I'm really tired, Henry. Can we do this tomorrow? Henry says, no, it cannot wait. Have a seat, young lady. Punky walks slowly and hunched over to the couch. Henry takes a seat himself. Henry says, Punky, tell me honestly, how was your now 2 days of school? Punky said, I told you, I made a new friend. That's good, right? Henry says, yes, it is, but maybe you could tell me more about her. For instance, does she dress a certain way? Punky says, she's well dressed and she's very kind and likes Nelson. Henry rolls his eyes saying, oh, Nelson. Henry then says, did you meet anybody else interesting? Punky then says, well, there's this cute boy who is 4 lockers down from me. Henry says, oh, a cute boy? How nice. What's he like? Punky says, he's got these brown, easy to get lost in kind of eyes. This smooth guy kind of hair that suits his cute face, and has this movie star smirk. Henry says, oh, I see. Well, what's his name? Punky says, I don't know. In fact, I don't know him at all. Then Henry says, I see. Henry pauses in thought. Henry then says, well, if he's 4 lockers down, who are your neighbors separating you? Punky leans back and sighs. Punky then says, 3 girls who got there before we did. Well, good night, Henry. Henry says, wait, who are these girls? Punky then says, if you must know, one of them's named Alicia, and they like hip-hop, okay? I'm going to my room. Punky stands up. Henry says, fair enough. If you choose to attend school in your current attire, you will not be allowed to attend. Punky says, wait, you're going to keep me home from school? Then Henry says, that is correct. Punky says, you can't do that. Henry says, I can, and I will. It's clear to me somebody doesn't approve of the way you usually dress, and I, your father, do not approve of how you currently dress. Especially when you're willing to lie to me about buying things for school. Then Punky says, it wasn't a lie, it was for school. I wore these clothes to school today, see? Henry goes, Punky. Punky says, I'm just growing up, why can't anyone accept that? Henry then says, growing up? Or growing apart from who you really are? Punky puts her head down. Henry says, do you even like what you're wearing, or furthermore the way you've been acting? Punky stays quiet. Henry says, well, how about your new name, Penny? Is that really what you want? Punky starts to tear. Punky says, no, I don't, and I don't like the Beastie Boys either. Henry with a very confused face. Henry says, who? Punky falls onto the couch into Henry's arms. Henry caresses her to comfort her. Punky says, how can they be so mean? I'm only 2 days into high school. I didn't do anything to them. Why don't they like me? Henry says, you know, Punky, you can't make everyone like you, and not everyone will. It's just a basic rule in life. At Punky's place, I experience it now and again. Even with service with a smile, some people in return only give me disrespect. Punky says, really? Henry says, sure. I've given them a reason to... Henry says, sure. Have I given them a reason to be snarky? No, of course not, but I don't let it get to me, because more often than not, there is a bigger picture. Punky says, like what? Yeah, like what? Henry says, well, some people may be having a rough time, causing them to have a chip on their shoulder. Maybe at home or elsewhere. Do you remember that time Brandon had a piece of bone stuck in his gum, and he was so grouchy? Punky says, yeah, it was like he was a different dog. Then Henry says, but when we investigated the problem and pinpointed it, he was back to normal once the bone was removed. Punky says, yeah, good thing too. Everybody seemed like a mailman to him at that time. Henry says, look, Punky, the most you can do is offer your friendship, and maybe these girls will open up to you, and you will see they're not as bad as you thought. Punky says, I don't know, Henry. They seem pretty nasty to me. Henry says, just remember, don't fight fire with fire. Just be kind to them. That's how you want to be treated, right? Punky says, right. Henry says, and so does everyone else. You haven't outgrown Punky Power, have you? Punky says, what? Punky Power's a lifestyle. Henry says, it's always gotten you places. Punky says, Henry, I'm glad that I have you as a foster dad. Some kids aren't as lucky. Could even maybe be causing people to have a chip on their shoulder. Henry says, the pleasure is all mine, Punky. It is Punky now, right? Punky says, yeah, it is. Maybe before school tomorrow you can take me to return these clothes. I just don't think they're me. Punky wipes off her tears. Henry says, "Okay, you got it." Punky gets up from the couch and looks at her stockings. She says, "Well, except these. Brandon chewed them up. I can't return these. Although I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere else in the store there are a pair with holes in them." Henry then says, "Maybe if we're lucky, we could get a refund for them anyway, believing that to be the way you purchased them." Punky says, "Yeah, maybe, but judging by your 15 attempts on the arcade game, Henry, I wouldn't say luck is on your side as of late." Henry shakes his head. End of scene. The scene fades into Punky's school. Cherry, Margot, and Amy are at their lockers. Margot says, "Where's Punky? Is she absent today?" Cherry says, "I knocked on her door this morning to go to the bus, but no one was home." Amy says, "Here she comes." Punky comes walking to the lockers. Punky is dressed in a multi-color t-shirt with a purple long sleeve underneath, wearing a matching purple skirt and lighter purple stockings, with the same boots from the other day. Punky says, "Hey guys." Cherry says, "Penny, you got your clothes back." Punky says, "Yup, and please, for heaven's sake, it's Punky again." Cherry says, "Oh, thank God." Margot says, "Well, it's good to have you back. We were already getting sick of this Penny character." Amy says, "And I'm looking forward to getting to know who Punky Brewster is." Punky smiles with her hands on her hips. Then Punky says, "And you will. Over lunch and Nelson." The three tough girls come to their lockers. Alicia says, "Penny, here's your tape back." She notices that she reverted back to her original fashion sense. Alicia says, "Penny, are you having a fashion crisis?" Punky says, "It's Punky, and I'm just wearing what I feel and what makes me comfortable," in a subtle sarcastic tone. Alicia says, "Those make you comfortable, huh?" Punky's friends stand behind her as to suggest their support for her. Standing strong, Punky continues, "Yeah, they do. Look, I know you guys don't like me very much, and you're right, you sniffed me out. I was trying to dress and act a certain way to have your approval, but I really don't think it's fair to not like someone without really knowing them, or by the way they look." Margot steps in. She says, "Yeah, I mean, my locker neighbors look like total dweebs, yet they were nice enough to install my mirror for me. See?" Margot opens her locker, revealing her large mirror installed onto the door, complete with lights and a compartment holding a hairbrush. The tough girls give Margot a weirded out look. Margot awkwardly closes her locker. Punky smiles and shakes her head at Margot, trying to help. Punky turns back towards the tough girls. Punky says, "Here, I want you to have this." Punky gives Alicia back the Beastie Boys tape. Punky says, "I think you'd appreciate it more than me. Their music doesn't speak to me, but if you're into it, cool." Alicia says, Thanks." Punky says, "My foster dad runs a restaurant called Punky's Place on the other side of town. It's a cool place to hang out. My friends and I are going to hang there after school." Punky's friend says, "We are?" Punky turns over to her friends. Punky says, "Yeah, it's on me. I'll be using the money I got for returning my clothes." She turns back around to the tough girls, saying, "You can come, if you want to." The tough girls look at each other. The group of cute boys come by. The Spanish-looking boy approaches Punky. The Spanish boy says, "Did I hear you say Punky's Place earlier?" "Yeah, I did," said Punky. The Spanish-looking boy said, "My dad brought home food from there the other day. It was awesome." Cherry says, "I'm an active staff member there as a cook. It's very possible I made it." The Spanish boy says, "Cool." Cherry says, "This here is Punky, the girl the restaurant is named after." The Spanish boy says, "Oh, no way. Nice to meet you, Punky. My name is Dean." Punky excitedly shakes his hand and is happy that she got his name. Then Dean says, "These are my friends Matt and Julian. Matt is the blonde-haired boy, and Julian is the boy with the flat top." Punky says, "These are my friends, Cherry, Amy, and Margot." Punky's friends wave. Punky says, "My foster dad Henry just got this arcade game at Punky's Place." Dean says, no kidding, we love arcade games. Cherry says, Punky has the high score. Dean says, cool. Punky says, we're going to hang out at Punky's place after school if you want to come. Dean looks at his friends, and they each seem interested. Dean says, sure, we'd love to come. The three tough girls look a little impressed at the situation. Then the bell rings. Dean says, well, we'll see you later, Punky. By the way, you have such an original name. Punky turns overexcited to her friends. She then turns over to the tough girls. Punky says, the invitation still stands. Then Punky turns over to get her books. The camera cuts to Margot smiling at the group of nerds, giving them a wave. Cherry takes notice. Cherry says, Margot, is that a flirtatious wave I see? Margot says, oh, get real. I thought seeing as they helped install my mirror, the least I can do is give them a wave. Amy comes back with her books in her arms. Amy says, ready to see if our egg hatched? Punky says, yep, let's go. The scene ends. The scene fades into Punky's place once again, revealing Punky and her friends, sitting with the brown-haired tough girl and the one who was wearing the denim vest. They're sitting together in a booth with pulled-up chairs to make more seating room. Cherry and the two tough girls are listening to Amy's Walkman tape player, with Cherry wearing an earphone and the tough girls each with one in their ear. The camera cuts to Henry, who is behind the counter, pleased at what he sees. Punky and Amy are talking to Margot, who is without an earphone. Amy says, our chick hatched today, and guess what we named our chick? Margot says, not Penny, I hope, or nickel or dime for that matter. Punky and Amy look at each other. Punky and Amy say, Nelson. The girls laugh. Margot says, should have seen that coming. Next, you see Brandon in a waiter uniform bringing everybody their food on his back, wearing a tray with a strap with everybody's food velcroed to the tray. Everybody's impressed by Brandon. Punky says, thanks, Brandon. You're sure a good help around here. Henry walks over to the gang. Henry says, he sure is, and we pay him in leftovers. Henry pulls Punky aside and talks to her silently. Henry says, Punky, how are things going with your new friends? Punky says, Dina and Candace are surprisingly nice and relatable, and I think they're starting to like Nelson from the looks of it, so we're off to a good start, I think. Dina, the brown-haired girl, and Candace being the denim vest girl with almost ginger-like hair. Dina and Candace take their earphones off. Cherry says, well, that's the end of their album. What did you think? Dina says, I think I can maybe get into it. Cherry makes this face as to say, all right. Candace says, I actually loved it. Dina says, you did, huh? I can't lie to myself, I loved it too. Cherry says, you did? Dina says, yeah, I really did. Cherry says, cool. Amy leans over to Punky, and she asks, say, do you suppose any of the others will show up? Punky says, gee, I don't know. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I'm happy all of you made it. I'm having a lot of fun. Cherry says, do you guys want to listen again? Dina and Candace says, sure. Henry walks over to Margot. Henry says, I know you're a little picky, Margot, so is there anything I can offer you of your interest? Margot says, do you have any sloppy joes? Henry says, you want a sloppy joe? Margot says, that's right, I'd like one of those, please. Henry says, sorry, but we don't offer those. Margot says, oh, how disappointing. Henry says, you're telling me. Margot eating a sloppy joe is a sight worth seeing. Next, the three handsome boys walk in. Dean says, hey guys. Punky gets up from her seat with a big smile on her face. Punky says, welcome all. Dean says, this is a cool place, Punky. Punky says, thanks. Dean then says, say, is this the machine you got a high score on? Punky says, it is. You're welcome to play. Dean says, I think I will. The three handsome boys head over to the arcade game. Punky looks back at Henry, who is with Margot, who is pondering over a menu. Next, Alicia walks in. Punky turns over surprised. Alicia has a guilty face. She walks over to Punky. Punky says hi. Alicia says, hey, Punky. Cool place. Punky says thanks. Alicia says, here, I want you to have something. Punky says, yeah, what? Alicia pulls out of her bag a poster. Alicia says, here, check it out. Punky says, wow, a Nelson poster. The camera cuts to Henry rolling his eyes. Alicia says, yeah, I noticed your locker is naked, so I figured you could put it up. Punky says, thanks, I will. Alicia says, it's the least I can do after giving me your Beastie Boys tape. Say, do you even like Beastie Boys? Punky says, sorry. Alicia says, it's okay. Alicia waves at the others who are eating at the table with Cherry, Dina, and Candace. Alicia waves at the others who are eating at the table while Cherry, Dina, and Candace are still listening to the Walkman. Dean says, hey, Punky. You don't have the high score anymore. Henry puts on a smirk from across the restaurant. Punky says, you beat it already? And Dean says, oh no, I didn't play yet. None of us have. We were just talking amongst ourselves who gets the first game when I notice you're no longer top scorer. Punky says, well, who is it now? Dean looks at the screen, and he says, it says Brandon B. Punky says, Brandon B. Punky and Henry look at Brandon. Punky and Henry go, nah. Dean then says, I'm about to play if anyone wants to witness greatness. Punky says, I'll watch. Margot says, me too. Everyone decides to huddle around the arcade game. Mrs. Johnson shows up. She walks over to see all the kids around the machine. She makes a disappointed headshake. She walks over to Henry. Henry says, sorry, Betty, but looks like you're going to have to wait your turn. Mrs. Johnson says, that's all right. Looks like your investment was worth it. Henry says, yes, and both you and I will be off the top score screen pretty soon. Mrs. Johnson says, yeah. Mrs. Johnson looks over at Henry. Mrs. Johnson says, half-price turkey sandwich says I beat their high score when it's my turn. Henry says, you're on. And that's the end. So, if anybody is listening to this, I hope you got a kick out of it. I literally have not read this since... Man, I don't think I've read this since I actually finished writing it. I think I had intentions of posting it somewhere, but actually reading it back, I'm actually impressed. I actually found this story amusing. It kept up with the themes of the show. It kept up with the themes of the characters. The way that they speak, I found that they spoke like how they would. Remembering the show, although I haven't watched the show in so long now, probably not since then. But anyway, I hope any Punky Brewster fans possibly listening to this got a kick out of it. This hypothetical episode where it's her first season of high school, and yeah. So anyway, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it.